The dust settled on Main Street as Jackson Reed dismounted his horse, his worn boots hitting the wooden planks with a familiar thud. 20 years of riding the frontier had taught him that some battles weren't worth fighting, and marriage, he decided, was one fight he'd simply surrender to without protest. At 38, he'd seen enough of life's harsh realities to know that love was a luxury men like him couldn't afford. What he needed was practicality, a partnership, someone to share the burden of his modest ranch and perhaps give him an heir before time ran out. Sarah Mitchell had seemed like the perfect candidate. She was a widow, quiet and unassuming, with 2 young children who needed a father figure. Their arrangement had been discussed over coffee at the general store, terms laid out as plainly as a business contract. She'd get security and a home for her children. He'd get a cook, a housekeeper, and companionship of sorts. No messy emotions, no grand expectations. They'd set the date for 3 weeks from now, a simple ceremony at the small church on the edge of town. Jackson had thought himself quite clever for solving his loneliness problem so efficiently. That was before he heard her voice. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon when Jackson rode into town for supplies. The summer heat hung heavy in the air, and most sensible folk had retreated indoors. He was loading sacks of grain onto his wagon when a sound stopped him mid-motion. It was singing, clear and powerful, cutting through the afternoon stillness like a blade through silk. The voice carried notes that seemed to dance in the air, rising and falling with an emotion so raw it made his chest tighten. Jackson followed the sound as if pulled by an invisible rope, his planned errands forgotten. The voice led him to the newly opened schoolhouse at the far end of town. Through the open window, he could see her, a woman he'd never noticed before despite his regular visits to town. She stood before a small group of children, teaching them a hymn, but the way she sang transformed the simple melody into something transcendent. She wasn't conventionally beautiful in the way Sarah was. Where Sarah was fair and delicate, this woman had a stronger presence. Her auburn hair refused to stay completely pinned, with rebellious strands framing a face marked by intelligence and determination. She wore a striking green jacket over a crisp white blouse, a choice that suggested she didn't follow the town's preference for muted colors. But it was her voice that held him captive, each note carrying stories of joy and sorrow, hope and despair, all woven together in perfect harmony. When the lesson ended and the children scattered, Jackson found himself still standing there like a fool. The woman emerged from the schoolhouse, nearly colliding with him. Up close, her eyes were the color of honey in sunlight, and they studied him with undisguised curiosity. "Can I help you, mister?" she asked, her speaking voice carrying the same musical quality that had drawn him here. Jackson removed his hat, suddenly aware of how dusty and rough he must look. "I heard you singing. I apologize for intruding, ma'am. I'm Jackson Reed." "Eleanor Hartley," she replied, extending her hand with a confidence that surprised him. Most women in town were more reserved. "I'm the new schoolteacher. Just arrived 2 weeks ago from Boston." Boston. That explained the different manner, the bold fashion choice, the way she looked directly at him rather than demurely at the ground. Jackson shook her hand, noting the firmness of her grip and the calluses that suggested she wasn't afraid of hard work despite her refined appearance. "You have a remarkable voice, Miss Hartley," he said, the words feeling inadequate to describe what he'd experienced. She smiled, and it transformed her entire face. "Thank you, Mr. Reed. Music has always been my passion. I sang in the church choir back home, performed at several concerts. My father thought it was frivolous, which is partly why I'm here instead of there." They talked for nearly an hour, standing in the dusty street as the afternoon sun painted everything golden. Eleanor spoke of her love for teaching, her frustration with Boston's rigid social expectations, and her decision to seek adventure in the West. Jackson found himself sharing things he rarely discussed, about his ranch, his years as a cavalry scout, the loneliness that came with his chosen life. Her laugh was as captivating as her singing, uninhibited and genuine. When he finally returned to his wagon, the sun was setting, and he'd completely forgotten about his supplies. More troubling, he'd also forgotten about Sarah and their arrangement. That night, lying in his bunk at the boarding house, Jackson couldn't sleep. Eleanor's voice echoed in his mind, and he found himself questioning everything he'd planned. Over the next week, Jackson made excuses to visit town more frequently than necessary. He'd time his arrivals to coincide with Eleanor's lunch break, and they'd walk together, her sharing stories about her students, him pointing out landmarks and sharing the town's history. She asked questions no one else had ever asked him, about his dreams, his fears, what made him happy. She listened with her whole attention, those honey-colored eyes never leaving his face. The problem was Sarah. Good, practical Sarah who'd done nothing wrong and deserved better than a fiancé whose thoughts were consumed by another woman. Jackson knew he should distance himself from Eleanor, honor his commitment, do the right thing. But every time he resolved to stay away, he'd remember Eleanor's laugh or the way she'd touched his arm while making a point, and he'd find himself riding back to town. Eleanor seemed equally drawn to him. She'd light up when she saw him approaching, and their conversations grew more personal, more intimate. One afternoon, sitting on the bench outside the general store, she'd turned to him with unusual seriousness. "Jackson, I've heard talk in town that you're engaged to be married." His stomach dropped. He'd been meaning to tell her, had rehearsed the words a dozen times, but could never find the right moment. "Yes," he admitted quietly. "To Sarah Mitchell. It's arranged for 2 weeks from now." Eleanor's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. "I see. And do you love her?" The directness of the question was so like Eleanor, cutting straight to the heart of matters others would dance around. "It's not that kind of arrangement," Jackson explained. "It's practical. She needs security for her children." "I need housekeeper." Eleanor interrupted, her voice sharp. "A solution to loneliness that doesn't require actually feeling anything?" Her words stung because they were true. "What would you have me do?" he asked, frustration bleeding into his tone. "I'm nearly 40 years old. I've given up on the idea of passionate love. That's for young people and poets." Eleanor stood, her green jacket bright against the fading day. "I think passionate love is for anyone brave enough to reach for it, regardless of age. But I also think you're a good man, Jackson Reed. And good men keep their promises. I hope you and Mrs. Mitchell will be very happy together." She walked away, leaving Jackson feeling more miserable than he'd been in years. The worst part was that she was right. He'd made a commitment to Sarah, and honor demanded he keep it. But how could he marry one woman while his heart called out for another? The next few days were torture. Jackson avoided town, threw himself into ranch work until his muscles screamed in protest. He tried to summon enthusiasm for his approaching wedding, but every time he pictured the ceremony, it was Eleanor's face he saw, not Sarah's. He'd traded the possibility of passionate love for comfortable convenience, and the regret was eating him alive. Sarah noticed his distraction when he finally forced himself to visit her. They were discussing wedding details in her small parlor, her children playing quietly in the corner, when she set down her teacup with deliberate care. "You've met someone," she said simply. Jackson's denial died on his lips. Sarah deserved honesty at least. "Yes," he admitted. "The schoolteacher from Boston. Eleanor Hartley. I've seen you two talking." Sarah's smile was sad but understanding. "She's quite striking, and from what I hear, you two seem well matched." "Sarah, I'm sorry. I never meant." She held up a hand. "Jackson, let me release you from our agreement. You're a good man, and you'd honor your word even if it destroyed you. But I don't want a husband whose heart belongs to someone else. My children deserve better than that, and so do I." The relief that flooded through him was immediately followed by shame. "I've behaved dishonorably," he said. "You have every right to be angry." "I'm not angry," Sarah replied. "I'm disappointed perhaps, but also grateful that we discovered this before the wedding rather than after. Go to her, Jackson. Life's too short for regrets." Jackson rode into town as the sun was setting, his heart pounding harder than it had during cavalry charges. He found Eleanor at the schoolhouse, cleaning chalkboards and organizing books. She looked up when he entered, surprise and something else, something hopeful, crossing her face. "I broke off my engagement," he said without preamble. Eleanor set down the book she'd been holding. "Why?" "Because I'm a fool who thought he could live without passion, without feeling, without love. Because even though I've only known you for 2 weeks, you've awakened something in me I thought was long dead. Because when you sing, I hear everything I've been missing, everything I've been too scared to want. She crossed the room until she stood directly before him. And what do you want now, Jackson Reed? You, he said simply. If you'll have a broken-down cowboy who's learned the difference between settling and truly living. I know I'm older. I know I have nothing to offer but a modest ranch and a heart that's entirely yours. But Eleanor, your voice, your spirit, everything about you has changed my destiny. I was planning a quiet marriage that would have been my slow death. Now I'm asking for a chance at real life, with all its messy emotions and grand expectations. Eleanor's eyes glistened with unshed tears. I left Boston because I refused to marry a man my father chose, someone suitable and boring who would have dimmed my light. I came west looking for something real, something true. I think I found it in a dusty cowboy who listens to me sing. When they kissed, Jackson understood what poets wrote about, what songs celebrated, what made people brave enough to risk everything. Her voice had called to something in his soul, and he'd answered. His destiny had indeed changed, transformed from a quiet surrender into a passionate beginning. The town talked, of course. Some criticized his treatment of Sarah, though she herself defended him and wished them well. Others thought Eleanor too bold, too different, too unsuitable for a man like Jackson. But when Eleanor sang at their wedding 3 months later, her voice soaring through the small church, even the harshest critics felt the power of what she and Jackson had found together. As Jackson stood beside his bride, he marveled at how close he'd come to missing this, to settling for comfort instead of reaching for joy. Eleanor's fiery voice hadn't just changed his destiny. It had given him one worth living.